Hi everyone. So in our first class section, we talked about the four subfields of anthropology, and those include physical anthropology, linguistic anthropology, archaeology, and sociocultural anthropology. Now each one of these four subfields has their own distinct methods and theories that they use to go about collecting their data. For now, we're going to focus on the fieldwork and methods used in sociocultural anthropology, or just cultural anthropology for short. Now, traditionally, anthropologists have worked with non-Western, non-industrial, non-literate groups. These are groups of people who live, in the corners of the earth, far away from us, who seem very, very different from us. Anthropological focus at the early part of the 20th century really was on these cultures that seemed very, very different from American or European societies. And this was because anthropology really grew up alongside sociology. And if you've taken sociology, you've heard of Emil Durkheim, right? He's sort of the father of sociology. He was also very influential in anthropology. And so with his influence, these two fields emerged, anthropology and sociology, with anthropology studying the non-literate non-West, and sociology really focusing more on the industrialized Western nations that we find in Western Europe and also the United States. But those early anthropologists were really focused on people who were living relatively non-complex lifestyles, hunter-gatherers, small-scale farmers, people like Trobriand islanders, as you can see in the picture here. Bronislaw Malinowski was a very famous anthropologist who spent a lot of his time working in the South Pacific, and particularly with these groups of people, to describe some of the variation that we can see in cultures around the world. Today, we do anthropology by focusing on two particular research approaches. We focus on fieldwork and ethnography. We talked about fieldwork a little bit in our first class. Fieldwork is the period of time in which we do our data collection. And when it comes to cultural anthropology, fieldwork means living with the culture that you're studying for at least a year or maybe more. And we refer to our study groups as perhaps our subjects, but it's probably more appropriate to refer to these people as our hosts. So we study our host cultures for at least a year to be able to fully understand what culture looks like for that particular society. Now, the other aspect of doing anthropological research is ethnography. Ethnography is a written account of a particular culture or a particular community or of a particular cultural practice. So let's say, for example, that we were going to do research with farmers in Algeria. Okay, let's say that's what we're interested in. At the end of all of our research, we would produce a written document, a report, that summarizes all of our findings about what it means to be a farmer in Algeria, and that would be an ethnography. There are lots of different field techniques that cultural anthropologists use to collect their data, and we're going to go ahead and work through about, 9 of these different techniques that anthropologists use. The number one technique, and it should be pretty obvious, is observation, direct observation. If we want to understand a group of people, we have to watch what they do. We have to observe their daily activities. But there's a particular type of observation that is particularly useful to anthropologists, and this is called participant observation. Participant observation is a research technique in which anthropologists not only watch what people do, but they actually get directly involved with the activities of the study group. So again, if we're studying farmers in Algeria, rather than sitting back and watching people farm their fields, as an anthropologist, we would use participant observation and get in there and get our hands dirty and actually farm along with them. Participant observation also requires that we live with the people that we're studying, that we take our meals with them, that we do basically everything that they do. And there are a couple of reasons why participant observation is so important. Number one, it helps us build camaraderie with the people that we're studying, and it also helps build trust. You can imagine if someone walked up to your house and said, I want to study you, I want to live with you and study you for the next 6 months. And then for the next 6 months, they just sat in the corner of your house and just watched you and wrote things down and just, maybe waited on you, waited to be served food and expected you to do all of the hard work for them. That would be kind of off-putting. But when a guest in our home offers to pitch in, offers to help with tasks like cooking and cleaning, offers to help with the work of the day, that really builds a spirit of friendship that is necessary in order for us to be able to get good, reliable data. Direct observation or participant observation also allows us to get that first-hand experience, that hands-on experience. A lot of times when we watch other people do things, it's difficult to understand exactly what the task involves unless we do it ourselves. And the example that I always like to use is like watching music videos. Like if I watch a Beyonce music video, I can watch that video 100 times, and I might be able to memorize visually all of the dance moves. But when it comes down to it, if I've never danced a day before in my life, I'm not going to be able to stand up and do it just having watched it 100 times. If I want to know how to dance, I have to actually get up and dance. I have to practice. And the same thing goes for anthropological research. If we want to know how people do things and why they do things, then we have to do it with them. Now you're going to watch a video that's going to be linked on Blackboard about some different anthropologists and the way that they use participant observation in their research. And that's going to be some really good examples of the importance of this particular technique. Participant observation really became important as Franz Boas began his research at the beginning of the 20th century. And if you'll remember from the first class, Franz Boas is sort of this father of anthropology. And he's the one who really turned anthropology from being a tool used by the American government to perhaps, shape things to their own goals, especially when it came to Native American groups. And Franz Boas said, well, listen, if we want anthropology to be a legitimate social science, we have to do things differently. We have to use cultural relativism, right? We have to understand cultures as they relate to themselves. We have to not be ethnocentric or biased against other people. So he's really responsible for the prevalence of participant observation today. The other thing about participant observation is that it has to be done with permission of the group. So anthropologists have to be very, very transparent about the research that they're doing. We can't walk into a community of people and pretend to be someone other than we are and collect data in that way. We can't mislead people about why we're there and what we're going to do with our results. So whenever we study a group of people, we have to make sure that we get consent from every single member of the group who's going to be involved in the study. And again, this is a matter of respect. There are some times that people wouldn't disclose certain pieces of information if they knew that it could be made publicly available at a later date. The second field technique that anthropologists use is conversation. Conversation is a very powerful tool for understanding different cultures. And we can use any type of conversation to collect data. We can use structured interviews where we sit down with people one-on-one and ask them very specific questions about their lives. But we can also use just casual chit-chat, just the little sayings that people use day to day, little complaints that people make about their work, or just idle conversations. We can also use gossip, and there's a really interesting story on NPR's This American Life about the role of gossip in HIV and AIDS prevention in Malawi in sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm going to include the link on Blackboard. The radio show is only a few minutes long, so I would definitely encourage you to give it a listen. It's very interesting. And you'll remember that Malawi has one of the higher AIDS and HIV infection rates in the world. And so it's a daily part of people's lives. And being able to avoid infection is very much at the forefront of the larger society. Probably society itself will be patriarchal. So charting out who's related to whom and how marriage patterns work becomes a really sort of fundamental baseline of information for any anthropologist because it can reveal patterns in social structure that we might not otherwise see. Anthropologists often work with people called primary informants. Primary informants are individuals within the study group who have some sort of specialized knowledge about the subject at hand. So if we go back to this example of studying farmers in Algeria, our primary informant in that situation would likely be someone who is a farmer in that Algerian community. You want to have as your primary informant someone who knows exactly what it is you're studying and who can sort of give you an inside opinion on what the particular practice is. So the primary informant serves as sort of a first source of information for the anthropologist. They're sort of like the man on the inside, right? The guy who knows everything, who can get you hooked up with the people that you need to talk to, and helps make life easier. Primary informants are extremely important for anthropologists, and pretty much every anthropological research team has at least a few people who help them, a few locals who help sort of guide the research or at least facilitate that research. A sort of alternative to the standard ethnographic report that anthropologists write is called a life history. A life history is when we take all of the data that we've collected and then we write about one particular person's life story. And typically, primary informants will be the subject of these life histories. So life history uses one individual as sort of an example for the entire group. Often it's easier to sort of digest information when it's from the perspective of just one person, and it provides a more intimate understanding of a culture by looking through one person's eyes. Life histories are typically produced as a result of longitudinal research, which is when we do research for long periods of time. You know, we'll spend a year in the field, and then the next year go back for another few months. The year after that, go back for another few months. So we're constantly checking back in with our study group, because not only do cultures change throughout the course of 1 year, and people have different practices throughout the course of 1 year, but from 1 year to the next, cultures and societies are constantly changing. So a life history might in fact span 20 years of a single person's life. But if you think about, when you were 16 years old versus when you were 20 years old versus, if you're older than that, 25, 30 or older, you know that your perspective on the world has changed a lot in that time. And so life histories are a great way of demonstrating how not only culture changes, but how individuals change their perspective on their own culture over time. One of the goals of anthropological research is not only to describe another culture in sort of scientific, objective, unbiased terms, right, using cultural relativism, but also to try to understand another culture from the perspective of someone who is on the inside. So we actually have two perspectives that we're aiming for here. We're looking at the outsider scientist perspective and also the insider perspective. So we can imagine a certain culture, culture X, right? As a scientist, we are standing on the outside of this culture looking in. This perspective is referred to as the etic perspective. This is the objective, impartial, neutral, unbiased, scientifically oriented perspective. But we also want to know what someone on the inside believes. And so this is referred to as the emic perspective. We want to know how people think about themselves, how they think about their culture, and how they think about the world at large. So sometimes we refer to this as the outside in and inside out perspectives. But having both of those creates a fuller understanding of a particular culture. Another field technique that anthropologists use is called problem-oriented research. And this is when we focus on a particular issue or a very particular question when we're doing our research. So rather than saying, all right, I'm going to go to Algeria and I'm going to study what it means to be a farmer, any farmer, all farmers, that's kind of a big question. So maybe we narrow down the focus a little bit. And instead of studying all farmers everywhere in Algeria, we'd say, what does it mean to be a farmer in the age of, post-Arab Spring? What does it mean to be a farmer who is contending with these very certain conditions of climate change and political upheaval in North Africa, in this one particular part of Algeria? So it's really narrowing the focus to get a deeper understanding rather than just sort of a superficial, broad understanding of cultural practices. Now, as I mentioned before, longitudinal research is something that many anthropologists use as a field technique. And this is when we go back to the same field site, we go back to the same study location year after year after year, so that we can understand how cultures change over longer periods of time. And this is helpful because it prevents us from just getting a sort of snapshot view of a particular culture, and it helps us understand more realistically and more holistically how cultures work within the certain pressures and environments that they're facing. The last field technique that we're covering here is called team research, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's doing anthropological research with a team. Now, in the past, in the early days of anthropology, anthropologists typically went out by themselves and would stay with their host groups for, a year or at least several months, and they would be sort of isolated there, and they would be working solo. Today, more anthropologists go as teams, because when you go with a group of people, not only does it provide a little bit more support for the research, but it also allows each individual researcher to tackle a particular problem or to look at a particular question. So everyone on the team is looking at one little slice of the culture, and then when you put all of that information together, it creates a much richer picture of that particular culture. It also makes it easier to do this longitudinal research because you can have people sort of rotating into the team and rotating out. Whereas if you are the only anthropologist who's studying a particular culture, if something happens to you, if you decide not to work there anymore, then the research just ends. And that's not necessarily a good thing. So longitudinal, or team research rather, is sort of a safeguard to make sure that longitudinal research can continue. Now, there are a couple of tools of the trade that most anthropologists use, and the most important of these is the field notebook. A field notebook is pretty much what it sounds like. It's a notebook in which you record all of the information that you collect in the field. It's where you record your data about interviews or conversations that you have with individuals. It's where you write down your daily schedule, like 6 a.m., woke up and helped milk the cows. 7 a.m., cooked breakfast and went out to the fields to begin harvesting. It's where you keep track of how you spend your time and the responses that you get, the observations that you make while you are in your host group. The field notebook is also where you record things that perhaps don't quite make sense to you. A lot of times when we're doing anthropological research, things aren't very clear. We don't necessarily understand why people do things in a certain way. And it's only after very long periods of time that the picture starts to become a little bit more resolved. So a field notebook is a great place to just jot down these questions, like why do these people eat this type of food in the morning and this type of food in the evening? Why do they have very strong rules about that? It might not make any sense to you at first, but perhaps later it will start to become clear. And then you have that little reminder in your field notebook to say, all right, I was interested in that. I can do some further study. We also like to use personal diaries when we're in the field. And this is similar this is similar to a field notebook in that it is a notebook where we can record what goes on from day to day. The difference between a field notebook and a personal diary, though, is that a personal diary is where we're allowed to put in our own personal thoughts, our own personal venting. I will say from experience, fieldwork can be hard. Fieldwork can be challenging. And there are many days when you're conducting fieldwork that you just don't want to be there. Maybe you're sick of the climate, you're tired of the food, and all you want to do is be back home in your air-conditioned apartment, watching TV and eating pizza. That happens, all right? We get, homesick, or at least just sort of, longing for something familiar. But those aren't necessarily thoughts that we would want to record in a field notebook, because a field notebook is meant to be a scientific log of our activities and of our research. And field notebooks are often duplicated to stay with a study group or duplicated for some sort of research institution. They're the kind of notes that we have to feel confident letting someone else read. And we might not want someone else to read all of our sort of innermost thoughts about our frustration with our work, or maybe frustration with one of the people in the group, because that happens as well. A personal diary is also a place where we can record things like when we get sick, because it happens. Everyone gets sick when they go to do field work. Not necessarily something that you'd want to record in your field notebook. But let's say 2 years after you complete your research, you're looking through your field notebook and you realize that for about 2 weeks your notes are just really shoddy. You weren't taking a lot of notes, you weren't taking very good notes on what you were doing, and you can't quite figure out why. Well, then you go back to your personal diary and look at those same dates. And maybe you realize, oh, right, I had malaria for 2 weeks. That's why my notes weren't great. I thought I was dying. That can definitely have an effect on how well you do your research if you're horribly, horribly sick. So personal diaries are sort of a double check for our research as well, just to provide that sort of personal researcher perspective on what was going on at the time the data was being collected. Things like video cameras and tape recorders are often useful for anthropologists, and that should be pretty obvious why. There's sometimes that we want to take digital images or visual images of the activities that people are involved in. We might want to tape record the conversations or the interviews that we have with people. Most anthropologists today also travel with a computer, and we take lots of notes. We do a lot of work in the field on our computers, but computers still don't replace those field notebooks because if there is one rule of doing field work, it's that anything that can break will break. And computers is sort of number one on the list, maybe number two after vehicles. But no matter where you are, what you're doing, if you have something that can break, it absolutely will. So you don't want to be reliant on any piece of technology that, if it were to break, you couldn't continue doing your research. So the field notebook is definitely a number one. The other two really important tools that anthropologists absolutely have to have when they go to do field work are language skills and a good attitude. Language skills, again, this should be pretty obvious. We want to be able to speak the same language as the people that we're studying. If we're constantly having to go through a translator or an interpreter, that's going to really slow down our data collection, and it's going to hamper how much information we can collect through our field work. It also just sort of, it isn't very personal to have to be talking through someone else for months at a time. So most anthropologists will spend months or years studying the local language before they go to do field work. And probably the most important tool that an anthropologist has is flexibility and a good attitude. Field work is hard, and it's frustrating, and it can be lonely and isolating sometimes. No matter how much you love the people that you're working with, no matter how much you believe in the research, there are just some days when you get fed up, just like at any other job. Except doing anthropological fieldwork, you're doing it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So you have to be able to sort of just roll with the punches. At a certain point, you realize that there's only so much you can control when you're living. But when we sit down for an interview, an anthropologist can make sure that respondents are answering questions in a way that actually addresses the question, and they can also follow up with other questions when there needs elaboration. One thing to remember when doing this interviewing process is that whatever culture we're in, we need to consider how many different people are required to talk to get a representative sample. So if we're working with a village of Algerian farmers, let's say it's a village of 1,000 people, it's not going to be possible for us to interview 1,000 people individually. We're going to have to interview a subset of that 1,000. But how many is enough? Is 5 enough? Do we need 100? Do we need 500? How many people are required to get a clear understanding of the average person's viewpoints, or the average person's belief systems. If we think about New York City, if you were trying to figure out how the average New Yorker feels about the MTA, you would have to ask a number of people in your interviewing scheme before you could get an average understanding of the MTA. And why is that? Well, New York is a very complex place. It's a very big place. And our feelings about the MTA are likely to change or likely to be different based on who we are as individuals, what our gender is, male or female, what our age is, what our ethnicity is or our race is, where in the city we live, right? If you only have to commute 15 minutes each day, you're probably going to have a very different opinion about the MTA than someone who has to commute 2 hours each way. So we want to make sure that whenever we do this interviewing scheme, we get enough people involved that we have a good representation of all different facets of the community. There are a number of responsibilities that anthropologists have when they're doing their research. And as I mentioned before, participant observation is something that we can only do with the permission of the entire group. And this goes for any type of anthropological research. Anyone that we study as a part of anthropological research has to know who we are, has to know why we're there. They have to know who gave us our money to do that research and how we're going to use the data once we leave. This is extremely important because over the last 100 years, in some parts of the world, there's been a lot of mistrust developed between certain groups of people and scientists or anthropologists, largely because of programs that have been put in place by government powers that basically exploit people or exploit natural resources. And so people can be very hesitant to provide information to outsiders for fear that they don't want to be caught for it. So we have to be very, very sure that we're completely transparent in our research goals. Most cultural anthropologists don't do things like collecting biological samples like blood samples or saliva samples, but some people do. And when we do collect these biological samples, we also have to go through a very strict set of procedures for making sure that we consider the rights of every single person in the study group. So there are some special sort of ethical considerations when it comes to collecting those samples. Finally, there are certain populations that exist within every culture that require even more care. These special populations include people like children. In the United States, we can't do any research with children who are under the age of 18. The age of 18, we consider them to be adults, but before that, we have to get permission from their parents. And that goes the same overseas. Regardless of how someone identifies as an adult or a child overseas, if they're under 18, we still have to get permission from their parents because children cannot give informed consent for research studies. The other populations that come to mind for these special considerations are people with significant physical or mental disabilities, people who might be coerced by some sort of perceived benefit to participating in the research because of their physical or mental disability, really aren't good study subjects. We don't want to be coercive. We don't want to try to manipulate anyone to be a part of our study. We want people to be involved because they want to be involved. Prisoners are the final group that requires special protection or special consideration. There's a really bad history, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world, of using incarcerated people as study subjects, particularly for medical studies and for psychological studies. Because basically the thought was, well, if you committed a crime and you're in prison, you've already given up your rights, and so now we can do whatever we want to you. As anthropologists, we completely reject this idea, completely reject that methodology. Prisoners have not given up their right to bodily autonomy, meaning that they can still make decisions about what happens to their bodies. And so as anthropologists, we never study prisoners unless we are asking a question that is directly related to what it means to be a prisoner. Okay, and that's just a matter of upholding human rights for, for everyone, whether you're incarcerated or not. There are some situations in which anthropologists have to consider these aspects of human rights. Many anthropologists don't have to worry about this, but there are some societies or some communities in the world where certain cultural practices are, to our eyes, violations of human rights. And that can be a really tricky situation for an anthropologist to be in. A human right could be defined as an inalienable right of an individual that supersedes the laws of a nation or culture. So again, the right to bodily autonomy, the right to choose what happens to your own body, is a human right. So no matter what the federal law says, a human right is something that cannot be denied. If we're working with a group of people who have a particular practice that violates these human rights, we have to consider what are our responsibilities, or what types of actions can we take. Some anthropologists would say it's not our job to step in, it's not our job to say anything, because as anthropologists we are meant to be scientific, we're meant to be unbiased, who cannot advocate for themselves. So in many places around the world where there are human rights violations, they persist because the people who are being harmed don't have the platform to speak up for themselves. And so it's not to say that anthropologists necessarily fix things for them, but anthropologists can shine a light on those human rights violations and perhaps open up the opportunity for people to change things for themselves. Now, there's no hard and fast rule about how anthropologists should deal with a situation like this. It kind of comes down to personal belief system. But based on the cultural anthropologists I know, I would say most of them lean towards the side of advocacy. They lean towards the side of, I'm someone who has a broader platform. I'm someone who has a voice that can be heard. And so I can help people change their lives according to the ways that they want to change them. So anthropology in that way can be a very political act. And it's this is an example of where anthropology moves away from that purely objective, unbiased perspective, and we can be sort of agents of change as long as the people we're working with want that change for themselves. So these are some of the field techniques and methods that anthropologists use, as well as a few of the considerations that we have when we're doing field work. We'll be going through the same list of methods and techniques for the other subfields